They gave us insulin to defeat diabetes. They gave us penicillin to win World War II. They gave us Prozac to heal the mind. For 150 years, Eli Lilly was the hero of American medicine. But heroes aren't supposed to hold patients hostage. Today, that tradition of saving lives has been sold off, piece by piece, to satisfy the hunger of Wall Street. We are talking about a corporation that transformed a life-saving humanitarian gift into a luxury item, marking up costs by over 1,000%, while patients died unable to pay. This is the double life of Eli Lilly, the genius that gifted us the power to live, and the ruthless profiteer that decided exactly how much that life is worth. From Civil War chaos to the industrialization of miracles. The origins of the global pharmaceutical complex are often imagined in sterile white laboratories or gleaming corporate boardrooms, but the genesis of Eli Lilly and Company lies in the mud, blood, and disease of the American Civil War. The founder, Colonel Eli Lilly, was not a businessman by training. He was a soldier and a chemist who had witnessed firsthand the horrific limitations of 19th century medicine. Serving as a Union artillery officer, he saw men die not just from Confederate grape shot, but from infection, dysentery, and the erratic, often poisonous concoctions peddled by the unregulated apothecaries of the era. Medicine in the 1860s was the Wild West, a landscape dominated by snake oil salesmen, patent medicines laced with opium and alcohol, and cures that were often deadlier than the diseases they claimed to treat. When the war ended, Lilly returned to a civilian life that felt chaotic and scientifically primitive. He drifted through failed business ventures and personal tragedies, including the death of his first wife and his own struggle with malaria, before settling in Indianapolis, Indiana. It was here, on May 10, 1876, that the 38-year-old colonel opened the doors to a small two-story laboratory on Pearl Street. He had a modest amount of capital, roughly $1,400, and a handful of employees, including his teenage son, Josiah. But he possessed a singular radical idea that would distinguish his enterprise from the carnival barkers of his time. He believed in standardization. At a time when the potency of a drug depended entirely on which batch of herbs a pharmacist happened to grind that morning, Colonel Lilly pioneered the concept of precise pharmaceutical-grade manufacturing. He introduced the Lilly pill, utilizing a revolutionary gelatin coating process that made medicines easier to swallow and masked the bitter taste of the active ingredients. He hired a botanist to verify the raw materials. He instituted quality controls. He famously declared that his company would produce only pharmaceuticals of the highest quality, a slogan that was less a marketing tagline than a moral reaction to the quackery he had seen kill his soldiers. This commitment to scientific rigor paid off. By the 1880s, Eli Lilly and Company was no longer a local shop. It was a burgeoning regional power. The colonel had successfully industrialized the production of medicine, moving from hand-rolled pills to machine-pressed capsules. When he died of cancer in 1898, he left behind a prosperous, respectable family business. But it was his son, Josiah K. Lilly, and his grandsons, Eli Lilly Jr. and Josiah Jr., who would take this respectable foundation and transform it into a global superpower. The younger generation understood that the future of medicine lay not just in better manufacturing, but in research. In the early 20th century, they made a strategic decision to pivot the company from a manufacturer of plant-based extracts to a pioneer of biological science. They began to hire university-trained chemists and biologists, building a research campus in Indianapolis that rivaled the best academic institutions. This investment in pure science was a gamble, a massive overhead cost with no guarantee of return. But in 1923, that gamble yielded the greatest return in the history of modern medicine. The breakthrough did not happen in Indianapolis, but in a cramped laboratory at the University of Toronto. Two Canadian researchers, Dr. Frederick Banting and his assistant Charles Best, had managed to isolate a mysterious secretion from the pancreas of dogs. They called it eslatin, later renamed insulin. They discovered that this substance could regulate blood sugar and effectively reverse the symptoms of diabetes, a disease that, until that moment, was a slow, agonizing death sentence. Before 1923, a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes meant starvation. The only treatment was a cruel caloric restriction diet that kept patients on the brink of death to extend their lives by a few months. Children with diabetes withered away into skeletons, slipping into comas before dying of organ failure. Banting and Best had found the miracle cure, but they had a problem. They could not make enough of it. Their laboratory method was slow, crude, and produced impure batches. They needed an industrial partner who could scale up the extraction process to treat millions. Eli Lilly and Company was the partner they chose. The company's head of research, G.H.A. Close, had attended a presentation by Banting and immediately recognized the potential. He convinced J.K. Lilly to throw the entire weight of the company's resources behind the project. What followed was a feat of industrial alchemy. Lilly engineers worked around the clock to figure out how to extract pure insulin from the pancreases of slaughtered pigs and cows. They sourced glands from the massive Chicago stockyards, shipping them by train to Indianapolis in refrigerated cars. They refined the chemical processes, stabilizing the volatile hormone. By the end of 1923, Eli Lilly was mass-producing Elatin, the world's first commercially available insulin. The impact was biblical. In hospitals across North America, comatose children woke up. Emaciated patients gained weight and returned to work. It was one of the most dramatic victories of science over death in human history. However, the seeds of the future controversy, the dark paradox of the company, were sown in the very contracts that made this miracle possible. Banting and Best, the discoverers, were idealists. They famously believed that insulin belonged to humanity. They sold the patent rights to the University of Toronto for a symbolic $1, declaring, "Insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world." But Eli Lilly was a corporation, not a charity. While the University of Toronto held the patent, they granted Eli Lilly an exclusive license to manufacture and sell the drug in the Americas. This exclusivity allowed Lilly to build an early, unassailable monopoly. While the inventors had given the idea away for free, the company that bottled it began to build a fortune. Even in the 1920s, the cost of insulin was a burden for the poor, and the company's control over the supply chain meant they faced little pressure to lower it. The tension between the dollar patent and the corporate profit margin was born in that moment, a tension that would fester for a century until it exploded into the pricing crisis of the modern era. With the success of insulin, Eli Lilly and Company ceased to be a mere business. It became a pillar of American life. The revenue from insulin funded a massive expansion of the research division, allowing the company to weather the Great Depression with ease. By the 1940s, as the world descended into the Second World War, the company was called upon for another miracle. The U.S. government approached Lilly to help mass produce a new experimental mold juice called penicillin. Just as they had done with insulin, Lilly engineers applied their deep knowledge of fermentation and industrial scaling to the problem. They became one of the primary suppliers of antibiotics to the Allied forces. If insulin had conquered metabolic disease, penicillin conquered infection. By the end of the war, Eli Lilly had saved countless soldiers from gangrene and sepsis, cementing its reputation as a patriotic, essential institution. But as the post-war era dawned, the character of the company began to shift. The founding generation, the Colonel and his son J.K., were gone. The grandsons, Eli Jr. and Josiah Jr., were aging. The company was transitioning from a family-run enterprise into a modern publicly traded behemoth. The Colonel's laboratory, once defined by a personal commitment to quality, was becoming a big pharma corporation, defined by stock prices, quarterly earnings, and the relentless pursuit of the next blockbuster drug. The era of the miracle cure was ending. The era of the blockbuster profit was about to begin. As the 1940s drew to a close, Eli Lilly and Company sat at the apex of the pharmaceutical world, shielded by a twin armor of scientific prestige and immense tax-protected wealth. However, the mechanisms the family built to preserve their fortune during this era were just as innovative and calculated as their drug discoveries. In 1937, amidst the economic ravages of the Great Depression, the family patriarchs, J.K. Lilly Sr. and his sons Eli Jr. and Josiah Jr., made a decision that would define the company's structure for the next century. They established the Lilly Endowment. On the surface, the endowment was a gesture of staggering generosity. It was a charitable foundation dedicated to the support of religion, education, and community development, primarily in their home state of Indiana. Over the decades, it would pump billions of dollars into universities, churches, and museums, turning Indianapolis into a city effectively patronized by a single family. But the endowment had a second, far more pragmatic function. It was a fortress against the taxmen. The aggressive estate taxes of the Roosevelt era threatened to dismantle family-owned empires upon the death of their founders. By transferring vast blocks of non-voting company stock into the tax-exempt endowment, the Sacklers of Indiana ensured that the family could retain voting control of the corporation without being forced to sell shares to pay inheritance taxes. It was a brilliant piece of financial engineering. It locked the company's ownership structure in place, creating a symbiotic relationship where the company's profits fueled the charity, and the charity's existence protected the company from hostile takeovers or market volatility. This structure meant that Eli Lilly was not just answerable to Wall Street. It was answerable to a massive, silent, family-controlled shareholder that prioritized long-term stability over short-term gains. This era also saw the first stirrings of the legal and ethical controversies that would later consume the industry. While the narrative of insulin was one of pure humanitarian triumph, the business reality was far sharper. Even in the 1940s, the U.S. Department of Justice began to look askance at the pharmaceutical industry. In 1941, the DOJ indicted Eli Lilly and two other companies for fixing the price of insulin. The government alleged that the companies, who controlled the entire supply chain of this life-saving hormone, had colluded to keep prices artificially high and uniform, effectively forming an insulin trust. The companies pleaded nolo contendere and paid small fines, but the case was a harbinger. It revealed that the dollar patent of Banting and Best had been fully captured by corporate interests. The precedent was set. A drug essential for life was a commodity, and its price would be determined not by the cost of production, but by what the market could bear. The company had learned that holding a monopoly on survival was the most profitable business model on earth. By 1948, the direct leadership of the founding dynasty began to fade. Eli Lilly Jr., the grandson of the colonel, and the driving force behind the research pivot, died. His brother, Josiah Jr., took the helm, but the sheer scale of the operation, now a multinational behemoth, required a new breed of management. The company began to transition from family rule to the rule of the technocrats, professional managers, lawyers, and marketers who viewed medicine through the lens of scale and efficiency. The Colonel's laboratory was gone. In its place stood a modern pharmaceutical giant, flush with cash from the war, protected by a massive endowment, and holding the monopoly keys to diabetes treatment. But the world of medicine was changing. The era of extracting cures from nature, like insulin from pancreases or penicillin from mold, was ending. The new frontier was synthetic chemistry. The scientists in Indianapolis were no longer looking for what nature had provided. They were trying to engineer molecules that could alter the human mind and body in ways nature never intended. Why cure a patient once when you can keep them sick and paying forever? The transformation of Eli Lilly and Company from the patriarchal, ethics-driven Colonel's laboratory into the ruthless titan of modern big pharma was not a gradual evolution. It was a violent metamorphosis, driven by a series of existential crises, scientific gambles, and criminal concealments that occurred between 1950 and 2000. This half-century marked the death of the old family ethos where the patient came first, and the birth of a new corporate theology where the stock price was the only deity. To understand the insulin price fixing of the 21st century, one must first understand the desperate, profit-hungry culture that was forged in the scandals of the late 20th century. The unraveling began quietly in the 1950s. As the glory of the penicillin era faded, Lilly needed a new revenue stream to maintain its massive research campus in Indianapolis. They found it not in curing disease, but in masking pain. In 1957, Lilly introduced a synthetic opioid painkiller called Darvon. Darvon was marketed aggressively as a safe, non-addictive alternative to stronger narcotics like codeine. It became a staple of American medicine cabinets, a mild pill for headaches and backaches. But the marketing was a lie. Decades later, independent studies would reveal that Darvon was barely more effective than aspirin for pain, yet it carried a significant risk of heart toxicity and addiction. It became one of the most abused drugs in America, linked to thousands of accidental overdoses and suicides. Lilly knew about the toxicity risks for years, but fought tooth and nail to keep the drug on the market because it was a cash cow. Darvon was the proto-scandal, teaching the company a dangerous lesson. A mediocre, dangerous drug could still be a blockbuster if the marketing was loud enough. But the true turning point, the event that traumatized the company and stripped away its remaining innocence, was the Oraflex disaster of the early 1980s. By 1980, Eli Lilly was in a slump. It hadn't had a major breakthrough in years. The executives were desperate for a miracle drug to compete with rivals like Pfizer. They bet everything on a new anti-inflammatory drug called benoxaprofen, branded as Oraflex. It was hyped as a cure for arthritis that could actually halt the progression of the disease, a potential gold mine for an aging population. The FDA approved Oraflex in 1982. The launch was a spectacle of modern PR, with press kits claiming it was safer than aspirin. The stock price soared, but within weeks the dream turned into a nightmare. Reports began to flood in from the United Kingdom and from U.S. hospitals. Elderly patients taking Oraflex were turning yellow. Their livers were failing, and they were dying. The scandal was not that the drug had side effects. All drugs do. The scandal was that Eli Lilly knew. Investigations by the Justice Department and the FDA revealed that Lilly executives had received reports of liver deaths from their overseas trials in the UK but had failed to report them to U.S. regulators. They had suppressed the body count to secure the FDA approval. The fallout was swift and brutal. Oraflex was pulled from the market just 3 months after its U.S. launch. In 1985, the Department of Justice charged Eli Lilly and Company with 25 criminal counts of failing to report adverse reactions. The company pleaded guilty to the misdemeanor charges and paid a $25,000 fine, a pittance. But the reputational damage was total. The good name of the colonel was dragged through the mud. The company was viewed by the public and the medical community as incompetent and dishonest. Inside the Indianapolis headquarters, the Oraflex disaster created a culture of paranoia and desperation. The company was financially wounded and legally humiliated. They needed a savior. They needed a drug so revolutionary, so culturally transformative, that it would make the world forget about Oraflex. They found it in a molecule called fluoxetine. The development of fluoxetine was a triumph of rational drug design. In the 1970s, Lilly scientists, led by Ray Fuller, David Wong, and Brian Malloy, decided to target a specific neurotransmitter, serotonin. The prevailing theory was that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance, specifically a lack of serotonin in the synaptic gaps between brain cells. The Lilly team synthesized a molecule that did one thing with laser-like precision. It blocked the reuptake of serotonin, keeping the chemical active in the brain for longer. It was the first selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. When the FDA approved fluoxetine under the brand name Prozac in December 1987, it did not just enter the pharmaceutical market. It reshaped Western civilization. Before Prozac, antidepressants were heavy, dirty drugs with terrible side effects like weight gain and lethargy. They were reserved for the severely mentally ill in asylums. Prozac was different. It was clean. It was energizing. And thanks to Lilly's brilliant branding, it was destigmatized. Lilly marketed Prozac not just to psychiatrists, but to general practitioners and family doctors. They positioned it not just as a cure for clinical depression, but as a tool for self-actualization. It was bottled sunshine. It was a drug that could make you better than well. The cultural impact was seismic. Books like Listening to Prozac became bestsellers, debating the ethics of cosmetic psychopharmacology. The pill itself, a sleek green and cream capsule, became a design icon of the 1990s. By 1990, Prozac was the most prescribed antidepressant in history. Sales exploded, reaching $350 million in the first year alone, and eventually climbing to nearly $3 billion annually. The Oraflex shame was buried under an avalanche of green and cream cash. Eli Lilly was back on top, but history was repeating itself. Just like with Oraflex, and just like with Darvon, there were ghosts in the machine. Almost immediately after the launch, a dark counter-narrative began to emerge. Patients with no prior history of violence were reporting sudden, terrifying, intrusive thoughts of suicide and homicide shortly after starting the drug. They described a state of inner torment, a physical restlessness known as akathisia, where they felt like they wanted to jump out of their own skin. In September 1989, a man named Joseph Wesbecker, a disgruntled pressman in Louisville, Kentucky, walked into his former workplace armed with an AK-47. He killed 8 people and wounded 12 before killing himself. Wesbecker had started taking Prozac just a month before the rampage. The Wesbecker case became the flashpoint for a massive legal war. The victims' families sued Eli Lilly, arguing that the drug had triggered his violence. This was the Oraflex nightmare all over again, but on a larger scale. If Prozac, the happy pill, taken by millions, was proven to cause murder and suicide, it would destroy the company. The trial, held in 1994, was a high-stakes legal thriller. Plaintiffs' attorneys unearthed internal Lilly memos from the 1980s showing that the company's own scientists were worried about the agitation and suicidality seen in clinical trials. One memo revealed that Lilly had considered giving patients tranquilizers alongside Prozac during the trials to mask the jitteriness. Another showed that they had manipulated the data to categorize suicidal behavior as overdose or depression, effectively hiding the signal in the noise. As the jury deliberated, it looked like Eli Lilly was going to lose. A guilty verdict would have opened the floodgates to thousands of lawsuits. So Lilly executed one of the most cynical legal maneuvers in corporate history. While the jury was still in the room, Lilly secretly approached the plaintiffs' lawyers. They offered a massive, undisclosed settlement sum, rumored to be in the tens of millions. But there was a catch. The plaintiffs had to agree to manipulate the trial record. They had to agree not to present certain damaging evidence about Oriflex and to effectively throw the case. The deal was struck. The judge, unaware of the secret settlement, allowed the case to proceed to a verdict. The jury denied the key evidence, returned a verdict in favor of Eli Lilly. Lilly publicly touted the not guilty verdict as scientific proof of Prozac's safety. "The jury has spoken," they declared. It was a lie. The jury hadn't spoken. They had been stage managed. It wasn't until years later that the Kentucky Supreme Court uncovered the scheme, calling it a fraud on the judicial system and changing the official record of the case from verdict for defendant to dismissed as settled. But the trick worked. The Wesbecker verdict killed the momentum of the anti-Prozac lawsuits. Lilly had successfully bought its way out of the truth. Prozac remained on the market, largely carrying no black box warning about suicide for another decade. The message to the executives in Indianapolis was clear. You can sell a dangerous drug and you can hide the data as long as you have enough money to buy the verdict. Secure in their dominance of the antidepressant market, Lilly's executives in the mid-1990s grew even more ambitious. They had conquered sadness. Now they wanted to conquer madness. They turned their sights on schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, a market that had been stagnant for decades. The weapon they forged was olanzapine, branded as Zyprexa. Launched in 1996, Zyprexa was hailed as a scientific breakthrough. It was an atypical antipsychotic, designed to silence the voices of schizophrenia without the horrific side effects of older drugs. But Lilly faced a mathematical problem. Schizophrenia affects only about 1% of the population. A drug limited to that 1% could be profitable, but it could never be the sun god needed to replace Prozac. To satisfy Wall Street's hunger for double-digit growth, Lilly needed Zyprexa to be taken by everyone. This necessity birthed the Viva Zyprexa campaign, a marketing operation launched in 2000 that would become the most infamous example of off-label promotion in pharmaceutical history. The campaign was a systematic effort to bypass the FDA. While the drug was approved only for adults with schizophrenia and bipolar mania, Lilly's sales representatives were trained to pitch it as a universal mood stabilizer for anyone who was difficult, agitated, or acting out. The company identified two vulnerable populations as their primary targets for expansion: the elderly and children. For the elderly, Lilly targeted the lucrative nursing home market. Sales scripts instructed representatives to frame Zyprexa to geriatricians not as an antipsychotic, but as a solution for behavioral symptoms of dementia. If a patient with Alzheimer's was pacing, yelling, or uncooperative, Zyprexa was presented as the safe and gentle way to calm them down. This marketing pitch concealed a deadly reality. The FDA had explicitly warned that giving antipsychotics to elderly patients with dementia increased the risk of stroke and death. Lilly knew this. Internal emails later revealed that executives discussed the mortality signal in their data, but decided that the nursing home market, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was too valuable to abandon. They were selling a chemical restraint that could kill the patient, marketed as a convenience for the nursing staff. The strategy for children was even more cynical. Although Zyprexa had no FDA approval for pediatric use, and despite the known risks of hormonal changes and weight gain in developing bodies, Lilly aggressively targeted pediatricians and child psychiatrists. Internal documents seized by federal investigators revealed a disturbing corporate mantra, 5 at 5. This slogan was taught to sales reps as a catchy way to advise doctors. Prescribe 5 milligrams of Zyprexa at 5 p.m. The goal was not to treat a specific pathology, but to sedate a disruptive or moody child just in time for the parents to have a quiet evening at home. The company was effectively marketing a powerful brain-altering antipsychotic known to cause massive weight gain as a chemical babysitter for unruly kids. The financial success of Viva Zyprexa was staggering. Sales skyrocketed, eventually reaching $4.2 billion a year. It became the single most profitable product in the company's history, surpassing even Prozac. But as the revenue climbed, so did the weight of the patients. In the clinical trials, Lilly scientists had observed a side effect that was impossible to ignore. Patients taking Zyprexa gained enormous amounts of weight. It wasn't just a few pounds, it was 40, 60, even 100 pounds in a matter of months. This visceral fat accumulation triggered a metabolic cascade. Patients developed sky-high cholesterol, triglycerides, and, most dangerously, hyperglycemia. Zyprexa was causing type 2 diabetes. The irony was Shakespearean. Eli Lilly, the company that had built its reputation on treating diabetes with insulin, was now causing diabetes with its antipsychotic. The executives in Indianapolis were terrified of this link. If doctors associated Zyprexa with diabetes, they would stop prescribing it, especially for long-term maintenance. The blockbuster status would collapse. So the company engaged in a cover-up. Internal emails from 1999 and 2000, which would later be known as the Zyprexa Papers, documented the conspiracy. In one exchange, a group of senior executives discussed the flood of reports about patients developing diabetic ketoacidosis. One manager wrote a sentence that would later be projected on courtroom screens across America. Unless we come clean on this, it could get too big to hang this on the underlying insanity. The strategy was explicit. Blame the disease, not the drug. Lilly directed its sales force to tell doctors that patients with schizophrenia were naturally prone to diabetes due to their poor lifestyles and insanity. They suppressed the clinical trial data that showed the direct causal link. They traded the metabolic health of millions of vulnerable patients, many of whom would develop chronic, lifelong diabetes, for the sake of protecting the quarterly earnings report. By the end of the year 2000, the Zyprexa machine was humming. The lawsuits had not yet started. The Department of Justice investigation was years away. To the outside world, Eli Lilly was a titan of innovation. But inside the company, the culture had fundamentally shifted. The scientists who once ruled the roost had been silenced by the marketers. The Viva Zyprexa campaign proved that the company was willing to break the law and endanger lives to expand a market. And this emboldened attitude was about to be applied to the next frontier of profit, the lifestyle drug. As the new millennium dawned, Eli Lilly was riding high on the psychiatric blockbuster successes of Prozac and Zyprexa. But the company's ambition was not limited to the brain. The executives in Indianapolis had watched with envy as their rival, Pfizer, launched Viagra in 1998. That little blue pill had done something unprecedented. It had transformed a medical condition, erectile dysfunction, into a multi-billion-dollar lifestyle market. It had proven that men would pay a premium not just to be cured, but to be enhanced. Lilly wanted a piece of that action. They possessed a molecule in their pipeline called tadalafil. Like Viagra, it was a PDE5 inhibitor designed to increase blood flow. But early clinical trials revealed a critical biochemical difference that the marketing department immediately recognized as a goldmine: half-life. Viagra worked for about 4 hours. It required planning. A man had to take the pill, wait an hour, and then had a narrow window of opportunity. It was effective, but it was stressful. Tadalafil, however, remained active in the body for 36 hours. This single pharmacokinetic fact became the foundation of one of the most brilliant branding campaigns in pharmaceutical history. Lilly realized they couldn't beat Pfizer on strength. They had to beat them on time. They positioned their drug not just as a tool for sex, but as a tool for romance. They branded it Cialis. Launched in 2003, the marketing for Cialis was a deliberate departure from the frenetic, masculine energy of Viagra. The ads were softer, slower, and targeted at couples. They featured older, attractive partners sitting in separate bathtubs on a hillside, watching a sunset. The slogan, "Will you be ready?" implied spontaneity. It promised a return to a natural, unhurried intimacy that Viagra, with its stopwatch pressure, could not offer. They dubbed it the weekend pill. Take it on Friday night, and you're good until Sunday morning. The strategy worked. Cialis quickly captured a massive share of the ED market, generating over $1 billion a year. It cemented Eli Lilly's reputation as a master of the lifestyle drug. They had proven they could vertically integrate the human experience. They could fix your depression with Prozac, stabilize your mood with Zyprexa, and now save your marriage with Cialis. But the success of Cialis also signaled a profound shift in the company's priorities. The resources poured into marketing a sex pill were resources not being poured into antibiotics or vaccines. The Colonel's laboratory was now a lifestyle factory. The focus was on drugs that people would take forever, chronic maintenance medications, rather than acute cures. A cured patient stops paying. A lifestyle consumer pays for life. This philosophy of chronic profit began to seep into every division of the company, infecting even its most historic and sacred legacy, diabetes. For nearly 80 years, the insulin division had been the steady, boring utility of the company. It was a low-margin, high-volume business. Insulin was a biological necessity, not a luxury. The price had historically tracked with inflation. But as the blockbuster culture of Prozac and Cialis took hold, the new breed of executives looked at the insulin division with frustration. They saw a captive market of millions of diabetics who had no choice but to buy the product, and they asked a dangerous question: why are we treating insulin like a utility when we could be treating it like an iPhone? The answer lay in innovation, or more accurately, the patenting of innovation. In 1996, the same year Zyprexa launched, Eli Lilly introduced a new genetically engineered form of insulin called Humalog. Humalog was an analog insulin. Scientists had tweaked the DNA of the insulin molecule to make it absorb faster into the bloodstream. It allowed diabetics to inject right before a meal rather than waiting 30 minutes. It was a genuine convenience, an upgrade. But crucially, because it was a new molecule, it was patented. This patent was the key. It allowed Eli Lilly to reset the economics of survival. With the older human insulins, the patents had expired and prices were relatively low. But with Humalog, Lilly had a monopoly, and they decided to use it. When Humalog launched in 1996, the list price for a vial was approximately $21. This was a premium over the older drugs, but still within the realm of affordability for most Americans. However, starting in the late 1990s and accelerating into the 2000s, something unprecedented happened. The price didn't just rise with inflation, it began to climb with the aggressive velocity of a luxury good. The executives justified this internally as the cost of R&D. They argued that the high prices of today funded the cures of tomorrow. But the math didn't add up. The cost of manufacturing a vial of insulin, the glass, the liquid, the labor, had actually dropped. It cost less than $5 to make, yet the price on the shelf was marching toward $30, then $40, then $50. Lilly had discovered the terrifying power of inelastic demand. A consumer can choose not to buy a new iPhone if it's too expensive. A man can choose not to buy Cialis. But a type 1 diabetic cannot choose not to buy insulin. If they stop, they die. The company realized that the market would bear almost any price because the alternative was death. This realization was the final nail in the coffin of the old Lilly ethos. The company that had once partnered with Banting and Best to distribute insulin at cost was now viewing its patients not as people to be saved, but as hostages to be squeezed. As the year 2000 approached, Eli Lilly stood at the summit of the pharmaceutical world. It was a titan of science and marketing, but the foundation of this success was rotting. The Prozac nation was built on suppressed suicide data. The Zyprexa wonder was built on a hidden epidemic of diabetes, and the insulin revolution was built on a pricing strategy that was slowly turning a life-saving fluid into a luxury good. The golden age of scientific discovery had ended. The company had traded the ethics of the kernel for the ethics of the stock market. As the 21st century dawned, the bill for this greed was about to come due. The era of the blockbuster was over. The era of the price of life and the bodies it would leave in its wake had begun. The transformation of Eli Lilly into a big pharma colossus by the year 2000 was not just a result of chemical innovation or aggressive marketing. It was cemented by a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar political fortification. To protect the golden goose of Prozac and the rising star of Zyprexa from the threats of regulation and generic competition, the executives in Indianapolis realized they needed to conquer Washington, D.C. just as effectively as they had conquered the medical schools. In the late 1990s, Eli Lilly built one of the most formidable lobbying machines in the United States. The company understood that their blockbuster business model was fragile. It relied entirely on patents. When a patent expired, the 90% profit margins would vanish overnight as cheap generics flooded the market. To delay this patent cliff, particularly for Prozac, Lilly engaged in a relentless campaign of legal and political warfare. They pioneered the tactic of evergreening, making tiny, often medically insignificant changes to a drug's formula or dosage to file for new patents and block competitors. They flooded the courts with lawsuits against generic manufacturers, using their vast legal budget to tie up smaller companies in litigation for years. This was not science. It was legal bullying designed to keep prices artificially high for American consumers. Furthermore, the company weaponized its deep political connections. The revolving door between Eli Lilly and the U.S. government became a legendary aspect of its power structure. Key figures moved seamlessly between the boardroom in Indianapolis and the White House. George H.W. Bush had served on the Lilly Board of Directors in the late 1970s before becoming vice president. Mitch Daniels, a senior Lilly executive who managed corporate strategy during the Prozac boom, left the company to become the director of the Office of Management and Budget under George W. Bush, effectively becoming the budget architect of the U.S. government. Alex Azar, who would later become the Secretary of Health and Human Services, built his career as a top executive at Lilly USA. These connections ensured that when Congress debated drug price controls or healthcare reform in the 1990s, Eli Lilly's interests were protected at the highest levels. The company spent millions annually on campaign contributions, hedging their bets with both Republicans and Democrats to ensure that the U.S. remained the only developed nation in the world that did not negotiate drug prices. By the turn of the millennium, the culture within the Indianapolis headquarters had become unrecognizable to the ghost of Colonel Eli Lilly. The Colonel's laboratory was now a financial fortress. The metrics of success were no longer lives saved or diseases cured, but shareholder value and quarterly growth. The scientists, once the heroes of the company, were now subservient to the marketers and the lawyers. This corporate soul sickness manifested in the way they viewed their most loyal customers. Internal documents from the late 90s revealed a disturbing psychological shift. Patients were no longer viewed as suffering humans, they were data points in a compliance algorithm. The goal was not just to get a patient on a drug, but to keep them on it forever. Whether it was the depressed patient on Prozac, the bipolar patient on Zyprexa, or the diabetic on Humalog, the strategy was retention. As the year 2000 closed, Eli Lilly reported record revenues. The stock was soaring. The golden age seemed unending. They had successfully navigated the Wes Becker suicide trial, launched the biggest psychiatric drug in history, and reset the price of insulin. They felt invincible. But this invincibility was an illusion. The aggressive tactics that had built the empire, the suppression of side effects, the off-label marketing to children and the elderly, and the shadow pricing of insulin, had created a massive, unquantified liability. They had built a dam to hold back the truth, but the water was rising. The 21st century would not be an era of celebration. It would be an era of reckoning. The bodies accumulating in the wake of Zyprexa's metabolic damage and the diabetics beginning to ration their insulin were about to demand justice. The rise was complete. The crisis was imminent, turning a $5 life-saving fluid into a luxury item. As the calendar turned to 2001, the executives at Eli Lilly and Company in Indianapolis were facing a new and terrifying variable in the American healthcare equation. For decades, they had dictated terms to doctors and wholesalers. But now, a new power broker had seized control of the market, the pharmacy benefit managers. These corporate middlemen, giants like Express Scripts and Medco, had consolidated immense power over the prescription drug market. They controlled the formulary, the exclusive list of drugs that insurance companies would pay for. In early 2001, the PBMs presented Eli Lilly with a stark ultimatum regarding their blockbuster insulin, Humalog: pay us or vanish. The PBMs demanded massive rebates, essentially legalized kickbacks, in exchange for keeping Humalog on the preferred tier of insurance plans. If Lilly refused, millions of patients would effectively be blocked from accessing the drug. Faced with the prospect of losing market share to their Danish rival, Novo Nordisk, the Lilly executives made a cold financial calculation that would define the economics of American survival for the next 2 decades. They agreed to pay the rebates, but to protect their profit margins, they decided to pass the cost directly to the consumer. Starting in 2002, Eli Lilly began to aggressively raise the list price of Humalog. This was the sticker price that uninsured patients paid at the pharmacy counter. It was a phantom inflation. The cost of manufacturing the insulin had not changed. It still cost less than $5 to make a vial. But the price on the shelf began to detach from reality. In 2001, a vial cost roughly $35. By 2003, it was climbing toward $50. This was the beginning of the rebate trap. The higher Lilly raised the price, the bigger the rebate they could offer the PBMs, and the more secure their market position became. But Lilly was not acting alone. In a display of market behavior that would later spark congressional investigations into potential collusion, Lilly and its two main competitors, Novo Nordisk and Sanofi, began to move in perfect synchronization. In 2003 and 2004, the phenomenon of shadow pricing became blatantly obvious. If Eli Lilly announced a price increase for Humalog on a Tuesday, Novo Nordisk would invariably announce a nearly identical price increase for their competing insulin, Novolog, within days. They were not competing to offer the lowest price to save patients money. They were competing to offer the highest rebate to the PBMs. The market for life-saving insulin had been transformed into a cartel-like structure where the price floor was constantly rising, and the ceiling was non-existent. While the insulin pricing engine was being quietly revved up in the background, a far more immediate and explosive crisis was detonating in the company's psychiatric division. The Zyprexa cover-up, which had held firm throughout the late 90s, began to unravel in 2002. Independent researchers and brave physicians began to publish data that Eli Lilly had tried to suppress. The link between Zyprexa and massive weight gain was undeniable, but new studies in 2002 and 2003 confirmed something far deadlier. The drug was causing rapid onset hyperglycemia and type 2 diabetes. Reports flooded into the FDA of patients, young, healthy adults with no history of blood sugar issues, slipping into diabetic comas after just months on the drug. Eli Lilly's legal department went into a defensive crouch. They knew the internal emails, the 5 at 5 directives, and the discussions about underlying insanity were smoking guns. Their strategy was to contain the damage through secrecy. As the first product liability lawsuits were filed in 2004, Lilly settled them one by one, forcing the plaintiffs to sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements. They were buying silence, paying millions to keep the Zyprexa Papers sealed in court vaults. However, the pressure from the FDA was becoming impossible to ignore. In September 2003, the FDA finally forced Eli Lilly to update the label for Zyprexa, but even this was a victory for the company's lobbyists. The warning was watered down. It mentioned the risk of hyperglycemia, but did not explicitly state that Zyprexa was worse than other antipsychotics, despite Lilly's internal data showing that it was. This regulatory half measure allowed the company to keep selling the drug as a first-line treatment, generating billions of dollars in revenue while patients continued to get sick. By 2005, the dam was breaking. The number of lawsuits had swelled from a few dozen to over 8,000. The liability was becoming a threat to the company's stock price. In a massive strategic move designed to clear the decks, Eli Lilly agreed to pay $700 million to settle the vast majority of the pending Zyprexa claims. The executives in Indianapolis breathed a sigh of relief. They believed they had successfully managed the crisis. They had paid a tax on their profits, but they had kept the incriminating documents secret. They thought the story was over. They were wrong. In 2006, the company faced a threat they had not anticipated, a whistleblower with a conscience. Dr. David Eagleman, a physician and researcher, had been hired as an expert witness for the plaintiffs in the Zyprexa litigation. During the discovery process, he was given access to millions of pages of Eli Lilly's internal documents. He sat in a room and read the emails from the marketing executives. He read the strategy documents for Viva Zyprexa. He read the cold-blooded discussions about marketing the drug to the elderly in nursing homes and to children, despite the known risks. Eagleman was horrified. He realized that the $700 million settlement was just hush money. The public and the doctors prescribing the drug still didn't know the truth. He decided to break the seal. In December 2006, in a dramatic act of civil disobedience that would change the pharmaceutical industry forever, Dr. Eagleman leaked the secret documents to a reporter at the New York Times, Alex Berenson. The resulting series of front-page articles hit the newsstands like a bomb. The Zyprexa Papers were laid bare for the world to see. The public read the emails where executives joked about weight gain. They read the plans to bypass the FDA. They saw the proof that Eli Lilly had systematically misled doctors for a decade. The leak triggered an immediate and ferocious reaction. The United States Department of Justice, which had been sniffing around the edges of the case, launched a full-scale criminal investigation. This was no longer a civil dispute about side effects. It was a federal inquiry into criminal fraud. As 2006 came to a close, Eli Lilly was a company under siege. Its stock price wobbled. Senators demanded hearings. The FBI was interviewing former sales reps. The golden age marketing tactics of the 90s were now being viewed through the lens of the federal criminal code. But even as the legal noose tightened around the psychiatric division, the insulin division continued its work. The price of Humalog had quietly ticked up again, crossing the $74 threshold. The company was fighting for its life in Washington, but in the pharmacies of America, it was still quietly bleeding the patients dry. The criminal investigation launched by the Department of Justice in 2007 was the most significant existential threat Eli Lilly had faced since the Oriflex disaster 2 decades earlier. But this time, the scale was exponentially larger. Federal prosecutors were not just looking at a failure to report data. They were building a case for systematic fraud. They alleged that the company had intentionally marketed Zyprexa for unapproved uses to generate billions in revenue, all while concealing the drug's metabolic dangers. The evidence provided by Dr. Eagleman's leak was damning. It showed a corporate culture that viewed regulatory compliance as an obstacle to be circumvented, not a rule to be followed. For 2 years, from 2007 to 2009, Lilly's legal team fought a high-stakes battle behind closed doors in Washington. Their goal was not to prove innocence, the emails made that impossible, but to negotiate a survival strategy. They needed to contain the damage. They needed to ensure that the company could continue to do business with the federal government, which would be impossible if they were convicted of certain felonies. The result of these negotiations was announced in January 2009. It was a historic day for the American legal system, but a confusing one for justice. Eli Lilly agreed to plead guilty to a misdemeanor violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But the headline was the money. The company agreed to pay a total settlement of $1.415 billion. At the time, it was the largest criminal fine for an individual corporation in U.S. history. The settlement included a $515 million criminal fine and $800 million in civil settlements with the federal government and the states. Attorney General Michael Mukasey stood before the cameras and declared that the government would not tolerate corporate fraud. But financial analysts saw a different story. They looked at the balance sheet. Zyprexa had generated nearly $40 billion in lifetime sales. A $1.4 billion fine represented roughly 3.5% of the revenue the crime had generated. It was, in the cold calculus of Wall Street, a spectacular return on investment. The company had broken the law to expand the market, made tens of billions of dollars, and then paid a small fraction of that profit to make the problem go away. The stock price barely moved. The market had priced in the crime. Most critically, the corporate veil protected the individuals responsible. Not a single executive at Eli Lilly was indicted. The managers who wrote the 5 at 5 emails kept their jobs. The executives who authorized the suppression of the diabetes data kept their bonuses. The company paid the fine, not the people. This outcome sent a powerful, dangerous signal to the entire pharmaceutical industry. Illegal marketing is a viable business strategy as long as the drug is big enough to pay the fine. As the dust settled on the Zyprexa case in 2009, Eli Lilly emerged bruised but intact. The company refocused its energy on its most reliable cash cow, insulin. And in 2010, the political landscape of American healthcare shifted in a way that would supercharge the insulin pricing crisis. The United States Congress passed the Affordable Care Act. While the law expanded insurance coverage to millions, it also inadvertently accelerated the trend toward high-deductible health plans. Insurance companies, looking to lower monthly premiums, began to shift the burden of cost to the patient. This was the final accelerant for the price of life disaster. Before 2010, most insured patients paid a low flat copay for their insulin, perhaps $20 or $30 a month. They were shielded from the soaring list price that Lilly, Novo, and Sanofi were inflating to pay rebates to PBMs. But under the new HDHPs, patients were required to pay the full list price of their medications until they met a deductible that could be as high as $5,000 or $6,000 a year. Suddenly, middle-class Americans with good insurance walked up to the pharmacy counter and were told that their monthly supply of Humalog, which had now climbed to over $100 a vial, would cost them $600 or $800 out of pocket. The shock was absolute. Families were forced into impossible financial choices. The shadow pricing continued relentlessly. By 2012, the price of a vial of Humalog had doubled again. By 2014, it was approaching $250. The price of Humalog had risen by over 1,000% since its launch in 1996. This price increase occurred in a vacuum of innovation. The formula for Humalog in 2014 was identical to the formula in 1996. The manufacturing process was the same. The R&D costs had been recouped decades ago. The price hike was pure, extracted profit taken directly from the pockets of the sick. As the price climbed, the human cost began to mount. The phenomenon of rationing exploded. In 2015, studies began to show that 1 in 4 American diabetics were rationing their insulin due to cost. They were taking half doses, skipping days, and risking their lives to make the vial last until the next paycheck. Doctors in emergency rooms began to see the carnage. Young patients, often in their 20s, were arriving in full-blown diabetic ketoacidosis. They were dying of a treatable disease because they were too poor to buy the treatment. One of the most heartbreaking cases was that of Shane Patrick Boyle. Shane was a type 1 diabetic who moved to Arkansas to care for his dying mother. When he crossed state lines, his insurance coverage lapsed. He went to a pharmacy to buy insulin and was told it would cost him $700. He didn't have it. He tried to ration his remaining supply. He died a few days later, just weeks after his mother. He died because he was $50 short for a drug that cost Eli Lilly $5 to make. Stories like Shane's began to circulate in the diabetic community. The anger was building. But in Indianapolis, the executives were insulated. They pointed to patient assistance programs that were notoriously difficult to navigate. They blamed the PBMS. They blamed the insurance companies. They refused to lower the list price. As the year 2015 drew to a close, Eli Lilly was a company at war with its own customers. It was generating record profits, its stock was soaring, and its new drugs were succeeding. But its reputation was rotting. It was viewed by a growing segment of the public not as a healer, but as a predator holding a gun to the head of the sick. The price of life era had enriched the shareholders, but it had created a generation of enemies who were now organizing, lawyering up, and preparing to take the fight from the pharmacy counter to the streets. The era of impunity was ending. The era of the empire of influence and its desperate defense was about to begin. Public outrage, dead patients, and the tweet that cost billions. As the political landscape shifted in 2016, Eli Lilly and Company found itself standing on a precipice. For decades, the pharmaceutical giant had operated with the quiet confidence of a sovereign entity shielded by a fortress of patents, lobbyists, and the opaque complexity of the American healthcare system. Its empire of influence in Washington, D.C. was legendary, a machine that had successfully blocked price negotiation laws and protected the rebate trap that fueled its record-breaking profits. But as the 2016 presidential election cycle heated up, the ground beneath the Indianapolis headquarters began to tremble. The company was about to collide with a force it could not bribe, lobby, or silence: the raw, organized anger of the dying. The catalyst for this uprising was not a regulator or a politician, but a hashtag: Insulin. All began to appear on Twitter and Facebook, at first a whisper among isolated patients, then a roar. For years, type 1 diabetics had suffered in shame, hiding their financial struggles, borrowing money from family to pay for the $300 vials of Humalog that kept them alive. Social media shattered that isolation. Patients began to post photos of their pharmacy receipts, slips of paper showing copays of $600, $900, or $1,200 a month. They shared stories of rationing, of reusing dull needles, of eating once a day to stretch their supplies. The data points of the insulin crisis were no longer hidden in actuarial tables. They were trending on timelines. In the volatile atmosphere of the 2016 campaign, drug pricing moved from a niche policy issue to the center stage. Both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton launched blistering attacks on the pharmaceutical industry. Trump famously declared that drug companies were getting away with murder, a rhetorical grenade that terrified the executives at Lilly. They knew their pricing model was indefensible in the court of public opinion. The cost of manufacturing Humalog had not changed in 20 years. It was still under $5 a vial. Yet the list price had soared over 1,000%. The spread was pure profit, and now the spotlight was on it. Lilly's initial response was to fortify the ramparts. The company ramped up its lobbying expenditures, pouring millions into Capitol Hill to ensure that the angry rhetoric of the campaign trail did not translate into legislative action. They focused their firepower on protecting the non-interference clause of the Medicare Part D legislation, the law that explicitly forbade the federal government from negotiating drug prices. This clause was the cornerstone of their profitability, and they defended it with the ferocity of a besieged kingdom. But while the lobbyists worked the halls of Congress, a tragedy occurred in June 2017 that would pierce through the noise of politics and give the crisis a haunting, undeniable human face. Alex Smith was a 26-year-old restaurant manager in Minneapolis. He was a type 1 diabetic, diagnosed at age 24. He was hardworking, independent, and responsible. Under the Affordable Care Act, he had been covered by his mother's health insurance plan, which shielded him from the brutal list price of his medication. But the law had a cliff. Coverage ended on a child's 26th birthday. In May 2017, Alec aged out of his mother's plan. His job did not offer health insurance. He looked into buying a private plan on the marketplace, but the premiums were $450 a month with a $7,600 deductible, money he simply didn't have. He decided to go uninsured and pay for his insulin out of pocket until he could find a better job. On June 20th, 2017, Alec went to the pharmacy to pick up his monthly supply of insulin and testing strips. The pharmacist rang up the total. It was $1,300. Alec looked at his bank account. He had less than $1,000 to his name. He was short. He left the pharmacy empty-handed. He did not ask his parents for money, perhaps out of pride, perhaps because he didn't want to be a burden. He made a fatal calculation. He decided to ration his remaining supply of insulin. He figured he could stretch what he had left until his next paycheck arrived. 3 days later, on June 27th, Alec's girlfriend called his mother, Nicole Smith Holt, worried that he wasn't answering his phone. Nicole drove to his apartment. She found the door unlocked. She found her son dead on the floor of his bedroom. The autopsy confirmed the cause: diabetic ketoacidosis. Without insulin, Alec's blood had turned to acid. His organs had shut down. He had died, alone and in agony, because he was $300 short for a drug that Eli Lilly manufactured for the price of a fast food burger. Alex Smith's death was not a medical failure. It was a financial murder. His mother, Nicole Smith Holt, channeled her grief into a burning righteous fury. She became the face of the insulin justice movement. She held up her son's ashes at protests outside Eli Lilly's headquarters in Indianapolis. She testified before state legislatures. She told Alec's story to anyone who would listen: CNN, the BBC, the New York Times. The Alex Smith narrative was a nightmare for Eli Lilly. It stripped away the complex arguments about PBMS, rebates, and supply chains. It reduced the issue to a simple, brutal moral equation. An American company was letting young people die to protect its stock price. There was no spin that could counter the image of a mother holding her son's ashes. Inside the corporate fortress, the executives went into damage control mode. Internal strategy documents would later reveal that Lilly was monitoring the protests closely. They knew they were losing the PR war, but they refused to do the one thing that would solve the problem: lower the price. Lowering the list price would anger the PBMS, reduce rebates, and potentially hurt their placement on insurance formularies. The business model was a trap they had built themselves, and they couldn't find a way out without sacrificing revenue. Instead, they launched a counteroffensive of corporate social responsibility. In late 2017, Eli Lilly announced the creation of the Lilly Diabetes Solution Center. It was a call center staffed by operators in Indianapolis, designed to help distressed patients navigate the complex healthcare system. The company touted the Solution Center as a humanitarian breakthrough. They claimed they were helping patients find coupons, savings cards, and patient assistance programs. They ran slick advertisements featuring compassionate operators on headsets. But to the activists on the ground, This was performative charity. The assistance programs were notoriously difficult to navigate. They required reams of paperwork, proof of income, and tax returns. They were means-tested, excluding the middle class. If a patient made just a few dollars above the poverty line, they were often ineligible. The savings cards had monthly caps and fine print that excluded anyone on government insurance like Medicare. Critics argued that the Solution Center was a cynical deflection. It was designed to help just enough people to provide a PR talking point, without actually addressing the root cause, the $300 list price. It was a classic tactic of the empire of influence. Privatize the profit and charity wash the suffering. They were offering a helpline to people they were pushing off a cliff. As 2018 arrived, the pressure continued to mount. The activists were getting organized. They were no longer just protesting. They were lawyering up. The first rumblings of a legal assault were beginning to be felt. State attorneys general, watching the opioid litigation unfold, began to look at the insulin market with fresh eyes. They saw the lockstep price increases, the shadow pricing, and the massive profits, and they smelled collusion. But Eli Lilly had one final card to play in Washington. In a move that seemed to signal their ultimate triumph, President Donald Trump nominated a man to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who knew the insulin pricing game better than anyone on earth. He nominated Alex Azar. Alex Azar was not just a conservative lawyer. He was the former president of Lilly USA. He was the very executive who had presided over the massive price hikes of Humalog from 2012 to 2017. The fox was not just guarding the henhouse. He was being given the keys to the entire farm. For Eli Lilly, it seemed like the ultimate victory of influence. But in the volatile world of 2018 politics, even the surest bets were about to go wrong. The confirmation of Alex Azar as the Secretary of Health and Human Services in January 2018 was viewed by the pharmaceutical industry as the ultimate coup. For Eli Lilly, it was akin to having a family member ascend to the throne. Azar had spent a decade inside the company, rising to become the president of Lilly USA. He had overseen the insulin division during its most aggressive price hikes. He knew the PBMS, he knew the rebate game, and he knew the lobbying strategies because he had helped design them. The executives in Indianapolis slept soundly, believing that with one of their own running the nation's healthcare system, the threat of regulation had been neutralized. But they had miscalculated the volatility of the Trump administration. President Trump, obsessed with the idea that other countries paid less for drugs than America, demanded action. He didn't want explanations about supply chains. He wanted lower prices, and he wanted them before the midterms. He put immense pressure on Azar to deliver. This pressure created one of the most fascinating and ironic spectacles in modern political history. Alex Azar, the ultimate insider, turned on his former colleagues. To save himself and to deflect the president's anger away from manufacturers, Azar decided to attack the middlemen. In May 2018, the Trump administration released a policy document titled American Patients First. It was a blueprint for lowering drug costs, and its primary target was the rebate trap. Azar went on television and publicly denounced the very system he had thrived within. He described the rebates as a hidden tax on the sick. He called for the elimination of secret kickbacks between drug makers and PBMS. For Eli Lilly, this was a double-edged sword. On one hand, blaming the PBMS was a convenient distraction. On the other hand, Azar was publicly confirming the activists' core accusation that the list price of insulin was artificial, inflated solely to pay off the supply chain. The Secretary of Health had effectively testified against his own former company. While Azar was stirring the pot in Washington, a far more dangerous threat was materializing in the heartland. The legal immunity that Eli Lilly had enjoyed for decades was beginning to crack. The activists' cries of collusion and price fixing had finally reached the ears of prosecutors who had the power to subpoena emails. In October 2018, the Attorney General of Minnesota, Lori Swanson, filed a landmark lawsuit that sent shockwaves through the industry. For the first time, a sovereign state was suing the three insulin giants, Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi, not for product liability, but for fraud. Swanson's lawsuit was a masterwork of forensic accounting. It alleged that the insulin market was not a free market, but a rigged game. It accused the companies of deceptive trade practices and engaging in a price-fixing scheme. The complaint laid out the pattern of shadow pricing in devastating detail. It showed charts where the price of Humalog and Novolog moved in perfect jagged synchronization for years. It argued that this lockstep pricing was statistically impossible in a competitive environment. It could only be the result of coordination. The filing of the Minnesota lawsuit was a watershed moment. It opened the door for discovery. It meant that state investigators could demand internal emails, pricing strategy documents, and communications between competitors. The empire of influence could bribe lobbyists, but it couldn't bribe a subpoena. But the legal assault didn't stop at the state level. Just weeks later, a massive class action lawsuit was filed in federal court in New Jersey on behalf of insulin patients nationwide. The plaintiffs were represented by Hagens Berman, a fearsome class action firm known for taking on Big Tobacco and Enron. The legal theory behind this federal lawsuit was breathtakingly aggressive. The lawyers didn't just accuse Eli Lilly of greed, they accused the company of racketeering. They filed the suit under the RICO Act, a federal law originally designed to dismantle the mafia. The complaint argued that Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, Sanofi, and the major PBMs had formed a criminal enterprise. It alleged that they had conspired to artificially inflate the list price of insulin to defraud patients, splitting the illicit proceeds through the rebate system. The use of the RICO statute was a nuclear option. If found liable, the companies would face treble damages. They would have to pay 3 times the actual harm caused. Given that the harm was billions of dollars in overpayments by millions of patients, the potential liability was existential. Inside the Indianapolis headquarters, the mood shifted from confidence to siege mentality. The legal department expanded. The company hired outside counsel from the most expensive white shoe firms in New York and Washington. They filed motions to dismiss, arguing that the pricing was lawful and that the rebate system was standard industry practice. But the judges weren't dismissing the cases. They were letting them proceed. As 2018 drew to a close, Eli Lilly was fighting a two-front war. In Washington, their former boss, Alex Azar, was attacking their business model. In the courts, prosecutors were calling them racketeers. And on the streets, the Trace Insulin for All movement was growing more radical. Protesters were no longer just holding vigils. They were engaging in civil disobedience. They were traveling in caravans to Canada to buy insulin for 1/10 of the price, live streaming the transactions to shame the American system. The pressure was building to a breaking point. The company needed a release valve. They needed to do something to lower the temperature before the executives were dragged before Congress to testify under oath. In early 2019, the executives hatched a plan. It was a cynical, clever, and ultimately desperate maneuver designed to silence the critics without actually lowering the profit margins. They decided to launch a generic version of their own drug. This move, which would be unveiled in the spring of 2019, was the ultimate shell game. It was an admission that the price was too high, wrapped in a marketing strategy designed to keep it that way. The empire of influence was about to try its boldest trick yet, pretending to compete with itself. In March 2019, just weeks before the executives were scheduled to face a hostile Congress, Eli Lilly executed a maneuver that was equal parts public relations stunt and financial sleight of hand. The company announced with great fanfare that it would begin selling a generic version of its own flagship insulin. They called it Insulin Lispro. To the uninitiated, this looked like a victory for the activists. The new drug would be sold at a list price of $137.35 per vial, exactly 50% lower than the list price of Humalog. The company's press release framed this as a benevolent act of disruption, a way to help patients struggling at the pharmacy counter immediately. But to industry insiders and healthcare economists, the authorized generic strategy was a cynical shell game designed to protect the rebate system, not dismantle it. Insulin Lispro was not a new drug. It was Humalog. It was manufactured in the same vats in Indianapolis, poured into the same glass vials, and capped with the same stoppers. The only difference was the sticker on the bottle. By creating a generic twin, Lilly could play both sides of the market. They could continue to sell the high-priced brand name Humalog to insurance companies and PBMs, maintaining the massive rebates that secured their formulary placement and their profit margins. Simultaneously, they could offer the lower-priced Lispro as a lifeboat for the uninsured and a shield against political criticism. The move was calculated to deflate the momentum of the hashtag #InsulinForAll movement. But it backfired. Activists pointed out that $137 was still an exorbitant price for a drug that cost $5 to produce. It was still higher than the price of Humalog had been just a decade earlier. Furthermore, because PBMs made less money on the lower-priced generic, many insurance plans refused to cover it. Patients arriving at pharmacies often found that Lispro wasn't in stock or that their insurance wouldn't pay for it, forcing them back onto the $300 brand name drug. The maneuver was exposed as a PR bandage on a gaping wound. The failure of the Lispro gambit set the stage for the main event of April 2019, the summons to Capitol Hill. The House Energy and Commerce Committee, sensing the public's rage, called the CEOs of the three insulin giants, Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi, along with the executives of the major PBMs, to testify under oath. The hearing was a spectacle of modern political theater, reminiscent of the famous 1994 hearing where tobacco executives swore that nicotine was not addictive. The pharmaceutical executives sat in a row, facing a panel of lawmakers armed with charts showing the 1,000% price increase of their products. Representatives grilled the executives with a ferocity that had been absent in Washington for years. They projected photos of Alex Smith and other victims on the screens behind the witness table. They asked simple, brutal questions. Why did the price go up when the cost of production didn't? Did you talk to your competitors before raising prices? How can you justify a $300 price tag for a century-old drug? Eli Lilly's representative stuck to a carefully rehearsed script. He blamed the complexity of the American healthcare system. He blamed the middlemen sitting a few seats away. He pointed to the new $137 generic as proof of the company's commitment to access. But the defense rang hollow. When pressed on why they didn't simply lower the price of Humalog itself, the answer dissolved into jargon about market dynamics and formulary access. The hearing did not result in immediate legislation. The gridlock in Washington was too strong, but it achieved something arguably more important. It destroyed the industry's moral authority. For decades, Eli Lilly had positioned itself as a scientific savior. The hearing stripped away that veneer and revealed a cartel of rent-seekers pointing fingers at each other while patients died. The term, the Insulin cartel, moved from activist placards into the congressional record. Following the hearing, the empire of influence shifted its strategy from offense to defense. They knew federal legislation was stalled, so they turned their attention to the states where the threat was more immediate. Across the country, state legislatures began to pass copay cap bills. Colorado was the first, capping the monthly out-of-pocket cost of insulin at $100 for state-regulated insurance plans. Other states followed suit. Lilly lobbied heavily to shape these bills. They didn't fight the caps outright, that would have been political suicide, but they worked to ensure the caps only applied to the patient's copay, not the insurance company's cost. This meant Lilly still got paid its full inflated list price. The cost was simply shifted from the patient to the insurance pool. It was a way to relieve the immediate pressure on patients without reducing the company's revenue. As 2019 turned into 2020, the battle lines had hardened into a stalemate. The activists had won the moral argument, but the company had preserved its pricing power. The lawsuits were grinding slowly through the courts, bogged down in procedural motions. The authorized generic was on the shelves, but uptake was slow. Then a new, unforeseen variable entered the equation, one that would stress test the American healthcare system to its breaking point and expose the cruelty of the employment-based insurance model that Eli Lilly relied upon. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the United States. For Eli Lilly, the pandemic was initially viewed as an opportunity for redemption. The company pivoted its massive research infrastructure with impressive speed. Within months, they had partnered with a biotech firm to develop monoclonal antibody treatments for COVID-19. The federal government pre-ordered hundreds of millions of dollars worth of the drug, bamlanivimab. Lilly flooded the airwaves with commercials touting science at the speed of life, positioning itself once again as the heroic innovator saving the world from a plague. But for the diabetic community, the pandemic was a nightmare scenario. As the economy locked down, millions of Americans lost their jobs. In the United States, losing your job usually means losing your health insurance. Suddenly, the high-deductible crisis that had plagued the middle class morphed into a no-insurance catastrophe for the newly unemployed. A laid-off waiter who needed Humalog was no longer facing a high copay. He was facing the full $275 list price with zero income. The demand at free clinics and safety net pharmacies spiked. The Easy Insulin for All activists, now organizing via Zoom, highlighted the grotesque irony of the moment. Eli Lilly was receiving billions in taxpayer money to develop COVID treatments. Yet, it refused to lower the price of insulin for the very taxpayers who were funding its research and dying in the economic fallout. The pandemic laid bare the fragility of the system Lilly had exploited. It proved that linking life-saving medication to employment status was a death sentence in a crisis. And while Lilly's PR team touted their antibody treatments, a quiet, devastating report was being finalized in the offices of the United States Senate that would prove once and for all that the insulin crisis was not an accident of the market, but a conspiracy of the boardroom. While the pandemic raged through 2020, a team of investigators in the United States Senate Finance Committee was quietly compiling the final pieces of a puzzle that had eluded the public for years. Led by Senators Chuck Grassley and Ron Wyden, The committee had used its subpoena power to pierce the corporate veil of the insulin cartel. They had demanded thousands of pages of internal emails, pricing strategy documents, and contracts between the drug makers and the pharmacy benefit managers. In January 2021, the committee released its findings. The report, titled Insulin, Examining the Factors Driving the Rising Cost of a Century-Old Drug, was a historic indictment of the pharmaceutical industry. It was not a collection of theories, it was a collection of confessions found in the company's own email servers. The 90-page document dismantled the industry's primary defense, that prices were rising due to the cost of innovation. The investigation found that Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi were not raising prices to fund research. They were raising prices to fund rebates. The report detailed a vicious cycle where the companies aggressively increased the list price specifically to generate the cash needed to pay off the PBMs and secure their spot on the formulary. But the most damaging revelations concerned collusion. The report cited internal emails where Lilly executives monitored Novo Nordisk's price increases in real time. One email chain showed executives discussing how they should match a competitor's price hike to the penny to avoid disrupting the market equilibrium. It was the smoking gun for shadow pricing. The investigation concluded that the companies engaged in signaling, making price moves that telegraphed their intentions to competitors, effectively running a cartel without ever needing to meet in a smoke-filled room. Senator Wyden stated plainly that the insulin market was lighting the match of drug pricing abuse. The report provided the evidentiary bedrock for the lawsuits piling up in state courts. It proved that the suffering of patients like Alex Smith was not an unfortunate side effect of capitalism. It was the engineered result of a rigged market. Despite the damning report, Eli Lilly held the line on pricing throughout 2021. The company was betting on political gridlock. The Biden administration, focused on the pandemic and infrastructure, had not yet moved on drug pricing. The empire of influence believed it could weather the storm. However, the cultural tide was turning. The anger over insulin had seeped into the popular consciousness. It was a punchline on late-night TV, a plot point in medical dramas, and a constant source of viral outrage on TikTok. The brand Eli Lilly was becoming toxic. Then, in November 2022, a singular, bizarre, and culturally defining event occurred that would do more damage to the company's stock price in one afternoon than 20 years of activism. It did not happen in a courtroom. It happened on Twitter. Elon Musk, the erratic new owner of the platform, had just introduced Twitter Blue, a feature allowing anyone to buy a blue check mark, previously a sign of official authenticity, for $8 a month. On the afternoon of November 10th, 2022, a prankster created a fake account with the handle at Eli Lilly and Company. They paid the $8, got the blue verification badge, and tweeted a single 9-word sentence. "We are excited to announce insulin is free now." The tweet was perfect in its simplicity. It looked official. It used the company's logo. And it promised the one thing millions of people had been praying for. The tweet went viral instantly. It was retweeted thousands of times within minutes. For several hours it remained live, unchecked by Twitter's decimated trust and safety team. Inside Lilly's headquarters in Indianapolis, panic set in. Executives scrambled to contact Twitter to get it taken down, but no one answered the phone. Meanwhile, the financial markets reacted. Investors, seeing the news and fearing that Lilly's lucrative insulin revenue stream was about to evaporate, began to sell. The stock price tanked. By the time the market closed the next day, Eli Lilly's stock had dropped by 4.37%, wiping out approximately $15 billion in market capitalization. $15 billion of value vanished because of a joke. But the true impact of the Twitter Blue incident was not financial. It was moral. The prank forced a national conversation about why the tweet was so effective. It was funny only because the reality was so grotesque. The prankster had held up a mirror to the company, and the reflection was ugly. In the aftermath, Lilly was forced to issue a humiliating apology on its real account. "We apologize to those who have been served a misleading message from a fake Lilly account." The internet's response was ferocious. "You should apologize for charging $300 for a drug that costs $5 to make," read the top reply. The corporate machinery had lost control of the narrative. They could bribe lobbyists, they could settle lawsuits, but they could not stop a meme. The incident proved that the public's patience had snapped. The company was no longer just a villain, it was a laughingstock. As 2022 drew to a close, the political pressure finally translated into legislative action. The Biden administration, emboldened by the public outrage, passed the Inflation Reduction Act. This landmark law included a provision that struck at the heart of the industry's power. It allowed Medicare to negotiate drug prices for the first time in history. Crucially, it placed a hard $35 cap on the monthly out-of-pocket cost of insulin for seniors on Medicare. This was a historic defeat for the pharmaceutical lobby, but the law had a hole. Due to Republican opposition, the $35 cap applied only to seniors. The millions of younger diabetics, the Alex Smiths, were left out. They still faced the $300 list price. This partial victory created an untenable situation for Eli Lilly. The company was now in the indefensible position of charging the government $35 for a vial, while charging a 25-year-old waitress $300 for the exact same product. The discrepancy was a PR nightmare that would not go away. In the C-suite in Indianapolis, CEO David Ricks looked at the landscape. The state lawsuits were advancing. The Senate report had exposed the cartel. The Twitter prank had humiliated them. And the President of the United States was using the State of the Union address to call for a universal cap. Ricks realized that the price of life strategy had reached its terminus. The political capital required to defend the high price of insulin was now exceeding the revenue it generated. The drug had become a toxic asset. So in March 2023, Eli Lilly did the unthinkable. They surrendered. In a surprise press release, the company announced that it would voluntarily cut the list price of its most popular insulins, including Humalog, by 70%. They also announced that they would automatically cap out-of-pocket costs for all patients, insured or not, at $35 a month. It was a total capitulation. After 20 years of claiming that high prices were necessary for innovation, after spending millions on lobbying, and after weathering the largest criminal fine in history, the company simply stopped. They admitted by action, if not by word, that the price had been arbitrary all along. They could have charged $35 in 2010. They could have charged it in 2015. They could have saved Alex Smith, but they waited until they were cornered. The empire of influence had fallen not to a single blow, but to 1,000 cuts inflicted by activists, grieving mothers, tweets, and the belated action of the state. The insulin war was over, but as the company retreated from one battlefield, it was already preparing to open a new front. Even as they slashed the price of their old cash cow, they were preparing to launch a new product that promised to be more profitable than Prozac, Zyprexa, and Humalog combined. They were about to cure obesity, abandoning insulin to chase the next trillion-dollar monopoly. The dramatic announcement in March 2023, That Eli Lilly would slash the price of insulin by 70% was not the final chapter of a book. It was merely the turning of a page. While the mainstream media celebrated the move as a victory for moral capitalism, the financial engines inside the Indianapolis headquarters were already revving up for a new conquest that would make the insulin empire look like a quaint cottage industry. The executives had not surrendered their ambition. They had simply reallocated it. They realized that the political cost of defending the insulin monopoly had become too high, a toxic anchor dragging down their reputation. So they cut the anchor loose not to drift, but to sail at full speed toward a new, shimmering horizon, the cure for obesity. This pivot marks the beginning of the modern era of Eli Lilly, a period defined by the aggressive monetization of the world's most prevalent metabolic crises. In May 2022, the FDA approved a molecule called tirzepatide, branded as Mounjaro for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. But the company knew, and Wall Street knew, that diabetes was just the legal beachhead. The true target was weight loss. Tirzepatide represented a quantum leap in pharmacology. It was a dual agonist, mimicking two different gut hormones to suppress appetite and regulate blood sugar. In clinical trials, patients didn't just manage their insulin levels. They shed 20% to 25% of their body weight. It was effectively gastric bypass surgery in a syringe. In November 2023, the FDA officially approved tirzepatide for chronic weight management under the new brand name Zepbound. With this approval, Eli Lilly entered the obesity wars, a commercial conflict that is projected to be the most lucrative in the history of medicine. Analysts predict the market for these drugs will exceed $100 billion a year. Lilly, poised to capture nearly half of that market, saw its stock price explode. By early 2024, the company's market capitalization breached $700 billion, making it the most valuable pharmaceutical company on Earth, surpassing giants like Tesla and Visa. The Colonel's laboratory had become a titan of finance. But as the company ascended to these dizzying heights, the ghosts of its past behaviors began to manifest in its new operations. The pricing strategy for Zepbound bore a striking, unsettling resemblance to the shadow pricing of the insulin era. Lilly set the list price of Zepbound at over $1,000 a month. Just as with insulin, the company argued that this high price was necessary to recoup R&D costs. Yet manufacturing experts estimated the cost of producing the drug was a fraction of that price. The spread was once again immense. And just like with insulin, the company engaged in a complex game with pharmacy benefit managers, ensuring that access to the drug was determined by insurance status. For the wealthy, Zepbound was a lifestyle miracle, a way to shed pounds before a wedding or a vacation. For the working class, who suffered disproportionately from obesity due to food deserts and economic stress, the $1,000 monthly price tag was an insurmountable wall. The class divide in American healthcare, which Lilly had exacerbated with insulin, was being reinforced with obesity drugs. Furthermore, the company's aggressive protection of its new monopoly revealed that the litigious spirit of the empire of influence was alive and well. As demand for Zepbound outstripped supply in late 2023 and 2024, a gray market emerged. Compounding pharmacies and wellness clinics began to synthesize their own versions of tirzepatide to meet the desperate demand of patients. Lilly's response was scorched earth legal warfare. The company filed lawsuits against hundreds of medical spas, wellness centers, and compounding pharmacies across the United States. They argued they were protecting patient safety from untested knockoffs. But critics saw a familiar pattern, a monopolist using the courts to crush cheaper alternatives and maintain high prices. It was the evergreening strategy of the insulin pens, repurposed for the Ozempic era. While the obesity gold rush dominated the headlines, Eli Lilly opened a second front in 2024 that carried even higher risks and higher rewards: the war on Alzheimer's disease. For decades, the search for an Alzheimer's cure had been the graveyard of drug discovery, a place where billions of dollars in R&D vanished without a trace. But Lilly persisted. In 2024, the company sought FDA approval for donanemab, an antibody designed to clear amyloid plaque from the brains of dementia patients. The clinical trials showed promise. The drug slowed cognitive decline by about 35%, but it also carried a terrifying risk. A significant percentage of patients in the trials developed brain swelling or bleeding, a condition known as ARIA. Some patients died. The parallels to the Zyprexa scandal were haunting. Once again, the company was bringing a drug to market that offered hope for a desperate, vulnerable population, but which carried severe, potentially fatal side effects. The FDA Advisory Committee debated whether the benefits outweighed the risks. But for Lilly, the financial calculus was clear. An Alzheimer's drug, even a moderately effective one, would be another blockbuster. The company pushed forward, utilizing its massive lobbying arm to advocate for swift approval and, crucially, for Medicare coverage. This reliance on Medicare highlighted the final great irony of the modern Eli Lilly. The company that had spent decades fighting against government price negotiations was now almost entirely dependent on the government to buy its products. The vast majority of patients for Alzheimer's drugs and many for diabetes drugs are seniors covered by Medicare. This dependency led to a historic legal clash in late 2023 and 2024. Following the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which allowed Medicare to negotiate drug prices, Eli Lilly did not accept the democratic will of the people. It sued the United States government. In a federal lawsuit, Lilly argued that the price negotiation provisions of the IRA were unconstitutional, a violation of the Fifth Amendment's takings clause. The company claimed that allowing the government to negotiate lower prices was tantamount to seizing their property without just compensation. It was a breathtaking legal argument. The company effectively asserted that it had a constitutional right to charge the government whatever price it wanted. They argued that their profit margin was protected by the Founding Fathers. This lawsuit proved that despite the insulin price cut, the soul of the corporation had not changed. When pushed, Eli Lilly reverted to its factory settings: litigation, obstruction, and the absolute defense of profit margins. The healers were still subservient to the profiteers. The lawsuit against the United States government, the aggressive policing of the obesity drug market, and the continued push for Alzheimer's treatments all point to a single inescapable conclusion. The Eli Lilly of the 21st century is a company defined by a profound and permanent duality. It is a Jekyll and Hyde entity, a corporation capable of breathtaking scientific benevolence and ruthless financial extraction in the same fiscal quarter. On one side of the ledger sits the Lilly Endowment. This charitable foundation, fueled by the dividends of the family's stock, has grown into a philanthropic colossus with assets exceeding $40 billion. It is the quiet, benevolent face of the dynasty. In Indianapolis and beyond, the endowment funds scholarships for underprivileged students, supports struggling churches, and maintains world-class museums. The descendants of Colonel Eli Lilly, who long ago stepped away from the daily management of the company, live lives of quiet, dignified philanthropy. They use the wealth generated by Zepbound and Humalog to do genuine transformative good, insulating themselves from the grittier realities of how that wealth is created. On the other side of the ledger lies the body count. The legacy of the company is inextricably linked to the thousands of lives damaged or lost in the pursuit of the next blockbuster. It is the legacy of the elderly patients who died of liver failure from Oriflex in the 1980s. It is the legacy of the victims of the Wesbecker shooting and the suicides linked to the early days of Prozac. It is the legacy of the children and nursing home residents who developed chronic diabetes from Zyprexa. And most painfully, it is the legacy of Alex Smith and the countless other American diabetics who died rationing insulin because the price was set by a shadow cartel. This duality raises the fundamental question that American society has yet to answer. Is pharmaceutical innovation compatible with the unrestricted profit motive? Eli Lilly's executives argue with fervent conviction that their massive profits are the necessary fuel for discovery. They claim that without the billions earned from the high prices of yesterday, there would be no Mounjaro to cure obesity today, nor any hope for an Alzheimer's cure tomorrow. They argue that the price of life is simply the cost of progress, and that to restrict their profits is to stifle the miracles of the future. But the critics, empowered by the insulin crisis, argue that the cost is too high. They point to financial disclosures, showing that Lilly often spends more on stock buybacks, dividends, and marketing than it does on research and development. They argue that a system which requires the poor to die so that the rich can have new cures is a moral abomination. They see the company not as an engine of innovation, but as a hedge fund with a chemistry set, extracting value from the sick to enrich the shareholders. As of 2024, the verdict of history is still being written. Eli Lilly has survived its scandals. It has weathered criminal convictions, congressional hearings, and public shaming. It has emerged richer and more powerful than ever, riding the wave of the obesity revolution. It has proven that in the modern pharmaceutical industry, there is no crime that cannot be settled with a fine, and no reputation that cannot be rehabilitated with a new miracle drug. The Colonel's Laboratory has become a global titan, a company that has saved millions of lives with its science while devastating thousands with its business practices. It stands as a monument to the complexity of American capitalism, a place where the greatest healers can also be the most ruthless profiteers. The story of Eli Lilly is a reminder that the power to cure is also the power to kill, and that in the boardrooms of Indianapolis, the line between the two is often just a matter of pricing. The insulin crisis may have faded from the headlines, but the system that created it remains intact, waiting for the next blockbuster, the next patent, and the next vulnerable patient who has no choice but to pay the price of life.